There is a room in Windsor Castle that has been cooking dinner since the 14th century. It has 8 great fireplaces, a roof of medieval oak, and copper pans on its walls, stamped with the ciphers of a dead king and a dead queen. Most people meet it as a charming survival, the oldest working kitchen in the country, £40 a ticket. But the room was never charming to the people inside it. The castle around it burned 900 tons of coal a year. It sent dinner up a staircase that most of the castle's staff could be dismissed for climbing. And half of what it cooked was never meant to be eaten at all. Subscribe here if the people who cooked the dinner interest you more than the people who ate it. And stay to the end, because the number that matters most in this story never appeared on a menu. Chapter 1. A room that has never stopped cooking. Somewhere beneath the staterooms of Windsor Castle, there is a fire that has been going out and being relit for 600 years. The room sits on the north side of a courtyard called the Kitchen Court, in the upper ward of the castle, about 20 miles west of London in the county of Berkshire. It is long and rectangular, running roughly east to west. Its north wall is probably not a kitchen wall at all. It is probably the old castle wall itself, 12th century stone, built for defence, and later found to be standing conveniently where somebody wanted to put a range against it. Everything else in the room is, in substance, a rebuilding of the 14th century. The Royal Collection Trust, the body that looks after the royal residences and everything inside them, describes the room in its own words. The Great Kitchen is the oldest working kitchen in the country. It was built in the reign of Edward III, and it has been used for over 650 years. That figure is worth handling carefully, because for years a larger one circulated. A great deal of press writing, and some older material from the Royal Collection itself, said 750 years. The smaller number is the correct one, and it is the one the Royal Collection publishes now. 750 years would push the room back into the 1270s, and there is no stone and no document to put it there. 650 years takes it back to the 1360s, which is where the building itself puts it. 650 years is still an extraordinary claim for a working room. Most kitchens of that age in Britain are ruins, or gift shops, or roped off with a plastic ham on a plate. This one cooks. When a head of state visits Britain today and sits down to a banquet at Windsor, the food arrives from this room. Every English and British monarch since Edward III has, at some point in their life, eaten something cooked between these walls. And that is the first strange thing about it. Continuity on that scale usually comes with a story. Great houses that survive 6 centuries produce libraries of family papers, portraits, letters, memoirs. This room produced almost none of that. It produced dinner for 600 years, and then it produced dinner again the next morning. Windsor is a working castle rather than a house a family lived in and left. By the end of the 19th century, a member of the royal household would describe it as a small town, sheltering and giving employment to some 2,000 people, and that figure counted Windsor alone, without Buckingham Palace or Balmoral or Osborne. 2,000 people sheltered and employed inside one set of walls, and at the working heart of them, one great kitchen. What it did keep is machinery, and the machinery is documented in remarkable detail. The room's chimneys can be counted. The width of its ranges is on record to the foot. The height of the screens that stood in front of the roasting fires is written down. The inscription on the clock on its wall is written down. What is not written down, almost anywhere, is who worked there. That absence is not a small gap. Across the whole of Queen Victoria's 63-year reign, the accessible record produces exactly one name for a royal chef, and it comes from a newspaper report of a charity dinner. The fullest description of the room at work that exists anywhere was written by a member of the royal household who chose not to sign it. A room measured to the foot, staffed by people the record cannot name, is the imbalance this whole story turns on. The castle around it grew in layers, and the great kitchen belongs to one particular layer, laid down in a single, enormously expensive burst of building. In 1357, Edward III began rebuilding the royal lodging in the Upper Ward on a scale nothing in England had seen. His clerk of works from the end of October 1356 was William of Wykeham, a name that would go on to become a bishop and the founder of 2 colleges, and a name that most accounts hand the kitchen to. The accounts are wrong, or at least imprecise. Wykeham left the post in November 1361. He was succeeded by William of Mulshow, a canon of Windsor, who held the office until April 1365. The old county history of Berkshire is specific about what happened under Mulshow. The reconstruction of the royal lodging was continued and completed, and a kitchen court was formed by the addition of several new buildings, including a gatehouse from the bailey. So the kitchen court belongs to Mulshow. It is a small correction, and it matters for a reason that goes beyond pedantry. The man who gets the credit for this room is the man whose name went on to be attached to schools and colleges and stained glass. The man who actually oversaw its building is a canon of Windsor that almost nobody has heard of. That pattern begins at the very foundation of the room, and it does not stop for 600 years. The kitchen was not built as a marvel. It was built as the working end of a palace, and its position says so. Edward's new lodging ran along the north side of the Upper Ward in 3 courts, and the kitchen sat in the last of them, behind a gate, out of the way of anybody arriving to see the king. Service below, grandeur above. The plan of the building is a diagram of who mattered. Kings came and went above it. The room stayed. Edward III built it. Henry VII re-roofed it. Elizabethan carpenters patched it. Georgian workmen mended it again. George IV's architect dressed it up. And a fire in living memory tore the disguise off. 6 centuries of monarchs, 1 room, and the same job to do every morning. What the plan does not show is the appetite. A room like this does not simply exist, it consumes. It wanted timber and stone and water and iron, and above all, it wanted fuel and hands, in quantities that only become visible when somebody thought to write them down. Somebody did, 500 years later, and recorded that about 900 tons of coal were burnt in the castle in a year. Before any of that, though, there was the bill for building it, and the bill for building it is one of the most remarkable numbers in English medieval history. Chapter 2. What Edward III spent on a kitchen. The king who built this room spent more on it and its palace than he earned in a year and a half of being king. The rebuilding of the Upper Ward at Windsor, of which the kitchen court was part, cost £50,000. One careful history of the castle puts it at 51,000. The difference does not matter. What matters is what that sum was set against. Edward III's typical annual income was about £30,000. So the works at Windsor came to more than 1.5 times everything the King of England received in a year, spent on one building programme. It was the largest amount any English medieval monarch spent on a single building operation, not the largest for a castle, the largest for anything. That is the frame this kitchen was built inside. A king spending more than a year and a half of everything he received on one set of buildings and placing a kitchen at the end of them. The layout he bought is still legible in the stone. His new palace ran along the north side of the Upper Ward in 3 courts, and they had names. The Little Cloister, the King's Cloister, the Kitchen Court. The range had 2 gatehouses, built as a matching pair, and their names describe the two halves of a royal life. One was the Spicery Gatehouse, named for the spicery, and it was the main entrance into the palace. The other was the Kitchen Gatehouse, and it simply led into the kitchen yard. Two identical gates. Through one of them came ambassadors. Through the other came meat. The meat had its own corridor, and the corridor is the single most revealing piece of architecture in this whole story. Running alongside the kitchen courtyard is a passage called the lardery. It is 14th century, it is beautifully vaulted, and it is decorated with carved royal roses, which mark it out as Edward III's work. Lardery means meat passage. A vaulted, carved, heraldically decorated corridor built to carry raw meat. That detail says more about the medieval English monarchy than any throne room. This was a court that could not conceive of a functional space. Even the route the carcasses took had to be finished to the standard of a chapel, because it belonged to the king, and everything that belonged to the king had to announce him. The roses were not there for the people carrying the meat. They were there because the stone belonged to Edward, and Edward's stone bore Edward's flowers, whether anybody important ever walked down it or not. The room at the end of that passage was built to burn what came down it. 8 great chimneys spread around the walls. A wide doorway in the southeast corner, later blocked, still visible in the stone. Windows along the south wall to let light in, and a lantern in the roof to let smoke and heat out. 4.5 centuries later, a second king spent on the same scale, and the kitchen was rebuilt around the old bones. George IV laid the first stone of his remodelling of Windsor on the 12th of August, 1824, and on the same day gave his architect, Geoffrey Wyatt, permission to change his name to the grander Wyatville. Parliament voted £150,000 to begin with. By 1830, over £500,000 had gone. By Wyatville's death in 1840, the total had passed £1 million. What that bought in the kitchen quarter is listed in Wyatville's own statement of works, delivered to a parliamentary committee in 1830. The kitchen gateway and 2 octagonal towers, each 78 feet high, rebuilt, containing staircases and bedrooms, the kitchen apartments, the confectionery apartments, the steward's room and the servants' hall, the beer cellar and the wine cellar, a servants' passage running along the north front, and the courtyard outside, lowered by between 3 and 6 feet, which meant digging out and carting away 13,000 cubic yards of ground. 13,000 cubic yards, shifted by hand and horse, to lower the floor of a yard outside a kitchen. George IV moved back into the castle on the 9th of December, 1828, and knighted his architect for the work. Look again at what Wyatville put in front of that committee: the kitchen apartments, the confectionery apartments, the steward's room and the servants' hall, the beer cellar and the wine cellar, the servants' passage in the north front. 5 of the items he chose to report, out of a rebuilding that would pass £1 million, describe the working half of the castle. The below-stairs world was itemised in that account, costed and set before Parliament line by line, in the same breath as the state apartments. The people who used those rooms never appear anywhere in the list. Their rooms do. Later, the architect Edward Blore put Queen Victoria's private chapel into the upper story of the old kitchen gatehouse. That chapel is where this story eventually catches fire. The exact size of the kitchen is one of the strange holes in the record. Nowhere in the official, academic, or heritage literature is there a length, a width, or a ceiling height for the great kitchen at Windsor. Almost every other significant room in the castle has been measured and published. This one has not. The people who catalogue royal architecture measured the reception rooms and the halls and the towers. and left the kitchen alone. What can be said comes at it sideways. The restoration architects who worked on the room in the 1990s describe it as being of 3-story height, which caused them real difficulty because there was nowhere to hide modern ventilation ducts in a space with nothing above the ceiling but roof. The undercroft next door, from the same century, is 193 feet long and 31 feet wide in 13 bays. The 2 octagonal towers Wyatteville later built at the kitchen gateway are 78 feet high each, by the architect's own account. A room 3 stories tall, beside a vaulted hall almost 200 feet long, under towers nearly 80 feet high. That is the district the kitchen lived in. What went on inside it for the first 400 years has to be assembled from the ranks of the people who worked there, because nobody described the room at work until the 19th century. The ranks survive because they were paid, and payments were recorded. Master cooks, yeomen, grooms, children, turnbroaches, scourers, soil carriers. They are strange, blunt, physical job titles, and almost all of them would be abolished within a few years of each other in the early 1800s. Before that happened, the room was rebuilt again, and this time somebody wrote down exactly what stood in it. Chapter 3. 8 fires and a fan in the chimney. The spits in this kitchen were turned by the heat of the fires that were cooking the meat on them. In 1897, a book appeared in London with a title that promised gossip and delivered something far more valuable: The Private Life of the Queen by a member of the royal household. The author has never been identified. They did not sign their work, and nothing since has pinned a name to them. What they had was access, and an eye for detail that no outsider could have faked. Chapter 27 of that book is called The Queen's Kitchen, and it runs from page 290 to page 296. It is the fullest description of this room at work that exists. Almost everything solid that is known about the great kitchen in the 19th century comes from somebody who chose to remain anonymous. Here is what they saw. Along the walls, 8 great chimneys, 1 in the east wall, 2 in the north, 2 in the south, 3 in the west. By the 1920s, 7 of the 8 held gas ranges. In the 1890s, the arrangement was different and far more violent. 4 immense close ranges stood in the room, 2 on either side, each about 12 feet wide. 12 feet is roughly the length of a small car. There were 4 of them. At either end of the room stood the roasting ranges, and these were open. No doors, no iron top, just fire. They were of such huge size, the anonymous writer noted, that 6 rows of large joints could be cooked in front of each of them at the same time. 6 rows, at each end. And in front of those fires the meat turned, and it turned by a mechanism that is close to beautiful. The long spits were turned by chains. The chains were driven by a kind of fan set in the chimney. The fan was driven by the hot air rushing up from the fire below it. The fire cooked the meat, and the same fire powered the machine that turned the meat in front of it. Nobody stood there winding a handle by the 19th century. The heat did the work. Somewhere in the room's earlier centuries, a boy called a turnbroach had done exactly that job with his hands, and by the end, a fan in the chimney was doing it. In front of the open fires stood meat screens 10 feet high. 10 feet is well above the reach of anyone in the room. The screens were taller than the people. 6 chopping blocks stood on the floor, each as big as a good-sized dining table. A dining table 6 times over, purely for chopping. And along the walls hung the copper. Rows upon rows of pots, pans, jelly moulds and turbot kettles hung with their lids directly behind them, many of them stamped with the letters Valois beneath a crown, the mark of Victoria Regina, Victoria the Queen. Others carried the cipher of George IV. A photograph from 1878 shows the walls packed with it, densely, like scales. Specialists who have examined the surviving pieces make one correction that would have annoyed the Victorians. The copper is English, not French. Saucepans with arrow-shaped base plates, cutlet pans with keyhole loops for hanging, bellied saucepans of the 19th century, 2 of them stamped VR. A kitchen that dressed itself in French ranks and French menus and French chefs was cooking in English pans. High on the wall hung a clock, and on its face were the letters G, the 4th Rex, and the year 1828. It commemorates the last great rebuilding of the room. It shows up in an inventory photograph of 1867, and on the north wall in a photograph of 1878, and the household was still recording its inscription in 1897. The room was lit by a range of windows along the south wall and by a lantern in the roof, a raised structure with openings that pulled the heat and smoke upward and let daylight down. Gabriel Tschumi, a Swiss boy who came to work in the royal kitchens at 16 at the very end of Victoria's reign, wrote down his first impression of the Windsor kitchen, and it is the closest thing this story has to a voice from inside the room. He remembered, on his first day at Windsor, thinking how much the kitchen reminded him of a chapel, with its high domed ceiling, its feeling of airiness and light, and the gleam of copper, well worn and burnished, at each end of the room. A chapel. That was the word a 16-year-old cook reached for. A painting in the royal collection shows the room before all of this, as James Stefanoff saw it around 1818. The hearths are still open alcoves, with soot trails running up the wall above them. 2 high windows light the south side. The lantern sits at the apex of the roof, and the copper, which by 1878 would cover the walls like scales, occupies a single set of shelves. 60 years separate those 2 pictures, and in that time the room filled up. On the night of a state banquet, the anonymous writer counted 2 score of glistening, juicy joints turning before the 2 open fires. 40 joints at once. And at a desk beside them sat the storekeeper, checking the quantities of food in course of cooking, so that nothing left the room without being written down first. And in that chapel, at the west end, there was one small open fireplace, and it was different from all the rest. It was used only for roasting the birds that went to the Queen's own table. Everything else in the room was industrial. 12-foot ranges, 6 rows of joints, 10-foot screens, chopping blocks the size of dining tables, 40 joints turning at once before a state banquet. And then, at one end, a modest domestic fire, kept apart from the machinery, for one woman's birds. The Christmas baron of beef was roasted at the same end, but the rest of the year that small fire existed for a single purpose, and its existence tells the viewer the shape of the whole household. In a room that fed a castle, one hearth was reserved. The people who tended it had job titles that would sound absurd in any kitchen today. Turnbroach, scourer, soil carrier, child of the kitchen. Within a few years of that clock being hung on the wall, almost every one of those ranks would be abolished, and the men who held them would simply stop being employed. Chapter 4. Ranks that no longer exist. For generations, a man was employed in the royal kitchen whose entire job title was the turner of the spit. He was called a turnbroach. The turnbroach turned the spit. That was the work. Standing beside an open fire large enough to roast 6 rows of joints in a room with 8 chimneys, and turning. The royal kitchen kept 6 turnbroaches in ordinary, meaning 6 on the permanent establishment, and each of them drew £30 a year in board wages. Board wages were the cash a household paid a servant in place of feeding him, and the fact that the men who turned the meat were paid in lieu of meals is a small piece of comedy that the record delivers without comment. The rank was abolished in 1815. Others went with it. The kitchen the Georgian monarchy inherited was organised on lines that had barely changed since the Middle Ages, and it had a vocabulary to match. At the top sat the master cooks, appointed by royal warrant, which meant the sovereign's own written authority. Below them came the yeomen, the grooms, and the children, appointed by warrant of the Lord Steward, the great officer of state who governed the supply side of the royal household. Below them again came the turnbroaches, the scourers, the soil carriers, and the doorkeepers, appointed by the clerks of the green cloth, the board of officials who audited the household's accounts and appointed in rotation. 4 levels of appointment for one kitchen, running from the monarch down to a committee of clerks. The board of the green cloth was the Lord Steward's governing and auditing board. It sat over the household's accounts, and its clerks controlled hiring at the bottom of the kitchen the way the sovereign controlled it at the top. A boy who wanted a place at the fire was entered on a rotation kept by clerks. A master cook was appointed by the sovereign's own written authority. One kitchen, and the paperwork for it, ran from a committee of accountants all the way up to the Queen's signature. The duties were divided by cooking method, and the divisions were absolute. The yeomen of the kitchen were chiefly responsible for soups and ragouts. The grooms of the kitchen were responsible for boiled meats. The children of the kitchen were responsible for roasting meats. Children, in this sense, is an old household rank. It sits in the appointment lists between the grooms above and the men who turned the spits below, and the word survived long enough into the modern world to sound like something it never meant. Soups and ragouts, boiling, roasting. 3 ranks, 3 techniques, each with its own warrant of appointment. The hierarchy ran through the food itself, so that a dinner leaving that kitchen had passed through 3 separate castes of worker before it reached the stairs. Below all of them were the ranks that had no craft at all. Scourers scrubbed. There was a master scourer and a second scourer, and beneath them assistant scourers on £30 a year. Soil carriers carried out the waste, on £38 a year by 1813. Doorkeepers stood at the doors, on £37 by 1812. Then, inside 5 years, most of it was gone. The turnbroaches, the assistant scourers, the soil carriers and the doorkeepers were all abolished in 1815. The grooms and the children of the kitchen appear to have been suppressed by 1820. A structure of ranks that had run since the Middle Ages was cut away in half a decade, and the men who held those ranks simply stopped being employed. The abolitions were made largely on cost grounds, and by the time the anonymous writer described the room at the end of the century, the spits were being turned by chains worked off a fan in the flue, driven by the rising heat of the fire itself. 6 turnbroaches had stood on that establishment. By 1897, the job was being done by moving air. What replaced the old ranks was a French brigade, chef at the top, master cooks beneath, then yeomen, roasting cooks, scourers, apprentices and kitchen maids. Fewer people, arranged on a Parisian model with Parisian titles, cooking Parisian food. And the change was resented, fiercely, by the people it displaced. When the royal household erupted into open conflict in 1841, and the newspapers got hold of it, the grievance they reported was not about wages. The Morning Post described a comptroller of the household, who, immediately on entering office, caused many old and valuable servants of the royal household to be pensioned, or sent to the right-about, in order to make way for a large number of French servants. Sent to the right-about, turned around, and marched off. That is a contemporary voice, printed in a London newspaper in 1841, describing what the modernisation of the royal kitchen felt like from underneath. English servants of long standing, replaced by imported ones, and the polite word for it was pensioned. The scale of what was lost is easier to see when the ranks are counted. 6 turn brooches, 2 scourers on the establishment and assistants below them, soil carriers, doorkeepers, grooms, children. Every one of those posts represented a man, a wage, and a place in a building. Every one of them vanished between 1815 and 1820, and the household books that record their abolition are the only document most of them ever generated. There is a further consequence, and it runs straight into the heart of this story. The old ranks were paid a compound of things: wages, plus board wages, plus diet, livery and lodging. A master cook in 1662 drew wages of £11, 8 shillings, and a penny halfpenny, which sounds absurd until the rest is added: his food, his clothing, and his room all supplied. Board wages of £219 sat on top of that, falling to £80 by 1680. In 1761, the master cooks received allowances in lieu of diet of £87 and 10 shillings each. By 1810, the second master cook had an additional £65 in place of house rent, coal and candles. Piece by piece, across a century and a half, the Crown converted its obligations into cash. A servant who was fed, clothed, and housed by a household was, in some sense, inside it. He belonged to the place. A servant paid a flat salary was an employee, and an employee can be let go. The commutation of diet and livery into money looks like modernization, and it was. It was also the quiet dissolution of a relationship, and the men abolished in 1815 were the first to find out what that meant. By the time Victoria came to the throne in 1837, the medieval kitchen had been swept out of the royal household, and a smaller, cheaper, French-speaking one had taken its place. The establishment books record the new structure with beautiful precision, post by post, salary by salary. And what those books show, when the figures are lined up, is a kitchen where the man at the top earned 16 times what the boy at the bottom did, in the same room, in the same year. Chapter 5. £15 a year for a boy. In the kitchen of the richest court in Europe, a boy was worth £15 a year, and the chief cook was worth 16 of him. The establishment of the royal kitchen was reconstructed in 1822 and revised in 1830, and the figures survive in the Lord Steward's books. They are not estimates. They are the payroll. The chief cook drew £240 a year in 1822, rising to £250 by 1830. The first master cook drew £221, falling to £200. The second master cook, £150. The 2 yeomen of the mouth, a rank that sounds like satire and is set down in the establishment books without a word of explanation, drew £109 and £100, settling at £110 each. The 2 yeomen of the kitchen drew 80 and 60, settling at 80 each. The roasting cooks took £80, and in 1830 the second of them was cut to 70. Then the floor of the room, the woman cook, £58, the master scourer and the second scourer, £40 each. The kitchen maid, £40 in 1812, reduced under George IV to 30, and the kitchen boys and apprentices, of whom there were 3, rising to 4, at £15 a year each. £15. The chief cook's £250 against the kitchen boys' 15 is a ratio of about 16 to 1, and both figures come from the same book, in the same year, for men working in the same room. The distance between the top and the bottom of that kitchen was structural, fixed by the establishment book, and written down years before either man was hired. Notice also the shape of the list. 1 woman cook at £58, 1 kitchen maid at 30, And in the 16 posts that made up the brigade under Victoria's first chief cook, that single kitchen maid was the only woman in the whole establishment. The royal kitchen of the 1840s carried twice as many scourers as it did women. £15 a year sat at the bottom of a pay system that had spent a century and a half turning food, clothing and lodging into cash. Board wages, allowances in lieu of diet, money in place of house rent, coal and candles. Piece by piece, the household had converted what it owed people into a figure on a page. The boy at the bottom of that page had the smallest figure on it and the least to fall back on, and losing the place meant losing the room in the same hour. The poverty at the bottom of that list is expected. The modesty at the top of it is the surprise. Charles Elmé Francatelli became chief cook to Queen Victoria on the 9th of March, 1840. He had trained in Paris under the legendary Antonin Carême. He had made his name at Crockford's gambling club, succeeding Louis Eustache Ude there, and he would later follow Alexis Soyer at the Reform Club. He went on to write 4 cookery books that were popular right across the Victorian era, among them The Modern Cook. His salary as chief cook to the Queen of the United Kingdom was £250 a year, paid quarterly at £62 and 10 shillings. His own biographer notes what that figure represented. It was an eighth of what the Prince Regent had paid Carême, a sum in the region of £2,000. The Crown was buying the top of the profession at 1/8 of what the top of the profession had lately been worth. And the comparison that really stings comes from the club world Francatelli had left behind. Louis Eustache Ude, the chef at Crockford's, was reported by the Morning Post in 1827 to be on £1,200 a year, besides numerous perquisites. A London gambling club paid its chef nearly 5 times what Queen Victoria paid hers. Set the figures side by side and the picture is complete. £1,200 at a gambling club. £2,000 for Carême under a prince who spent as though money were a rumour. £250 for the chief cook of the reigning monarch. £15 for the boy standing beside him. And about 900 tons of coal a year burnt in the castle around them. By the end of the century, the top of the structure had climbed sharply. The anonymous member of the household writing in 1897 records that the Queen's kitchen was ruled over by a chef whose salary was close on £700 a year. 2 comparisons from the same book, in the same year, put that £700 in its place. The Queen kept 8 maids of honour, attendants of her own household, and each was paid £300 a year. 8 of them at £300 apiece comes to £2,400 a year spent on attendance alone, against £700 for the man running the kitchen that fed the castle. At the other end of the estate, the Frogmore lodge-keeper, a man named Jonathan Mace, was paid 16 shillings a week and perquisites. 16 shillings a week comes to a little over £40 a year, and the word perquisites is doing a great deal of quiet work in that sentence, as the rest of this story will show. Above all of it sat the civil list, the annual grant Parliament voted to run the monarchy. In 1897, it stood at £385,000 a year. 60,000 went to the Queen's privy purse, her personal money. 172,500 went to the expenses of the household. 131,260 went to salaries and retiring allowances. 13,200 went to royal bounty, arms and special service. And 8,040 was left unappropriated. £385,000 a year to run a monarchy, and 700 of it for the man running the kitchen at the middle of it. £700 put the royal chef at last in the same world as the club chefs of 70 years earlier. What the rest of the kitchen was earning by then is simply not known. No published figure exists for any royal kitchen post between 1842 and 1897 other than the chef's. No figure for any of them could be found. So the honest statement is this. The record shows what the Crown paid the man at the top in 1830 and again in 1897. For the 60 years in between, for everybody else, there is a gap where the wages of 40 people should be. The chef of 1897 had 4 master cooks under him, 2 yeomen of the kitchen, 2 assistant cooks, 2 roasting cooks, about 16 apprentices, and half a dozen kitchen maids. 33 people in the great kitchen alone. Another 7 in the confectionery under the confectioner. Pastry staff and vegetable staff beyond that, unnumbered, plus the clerk of the kitchen and the storekeeper. Comfortably over 40 people across the kitchen departments of one castle. And in the whole of the printed record of Queen Victoria's 63-year reign, one of them is named in a newspaper report of a charity dinner, and one of them wrote a book about the room and chose not to sign it. Only one of them ever made the front pages in his own lifetime, and he got there by shouting at an officer of the household and running away from a policeman. Chapter 6. The Chief Cook and the Policeman. On a Monday in the winter of 1841, the Queen's chief cook insulted a household officer in front of the assembled staff of a palace, and was gone before the police arrived. Charles Elmé Francatelli was born in 1805 and died on the 10th of August, 1876. Carême had taught him. Crockfords had made him famous. He came into the royal kitchen at the instigation of the 18th Earl of Errol, the Lord Steward, and he started on the 9th of March, 1840, the day after his predecessor left. In the household account books, his title is Chief Cook. On his own title page of 1846, he styled himself late Maître d'Hôtel and Chief Cook to Her Majesty the Queen, which was a slight promotion of himself and a very Francatelli thing to do. The 1841 census finds him living at St. James's Palace with his mother Sarah, his wife Elizabeth, and his son Ernest. A man at the top of his profession, housed in a palace, cooking for the young Queen, and paid £250 a year to do it. He lasted 24 months. What went wrong is documented in a way almost nothing else in this story is, because a London newspaper printed it. On the 2nd of December, 1841, the Morning Post ran an item headed Fracas at Buckingham Palace. On the Tuesday, the paper reported, a long investigation had taken place at the Board of Green Cloth, before the Lord Steward of Her Majesty's household, when nearly 20 persons of the royal establishment were examined, touching an affray between Mr. Norton, the Deputy Comptroller of Her Majesty's household, and Mr. Francatelli, Chief Cook of the Royal Kitchen. Nearly 20 witnesses. For a row in a kitchen. The Post then explained the atmosphere, and its explanation is the most valuable paragraph in the whole affair. It was well known, the paper wrote, that broils, jealousies, and ill feeling had been existing in the royal establishment ever since the appointment of the Honourable Charles Augustus Murray to the office of Comptroller. That gentleman, on entering office, had caused many old and valuable servants of the royal household to be pensioned or sent to the right-about, in order to make way for a large number of French servants. Against that background, the paper drew its portrait of the chief cook. Francatelli, it wrote, had kept his department in continual broils, which had been the cause of many dismissals and numerous complaints to the Lord Steward. And then the incident itself. On Monday last, Mr. Francatelli took an opportunity of insulting Mr. Norton in the presence of all the pages and about 40 others, when high words ensued, which ended in a policeman being sent to take Francatelli into custody, but he managed to make his escape before the officer arrived. The result of the investigation, the paper concluded, was the suspension of Francatelli until the matter should be laid before Her Majesty and Prince Albert. Two details deserve unpicking. The first is that Norton was the Deputy Comptroller, not the Comptroller. Retellings routinely promote him. The Comptroller was Murray, the man who had brought the French cooks in. The row ran along the fault line of the whole household, and two men happened to be standing on it when it opened. The second is the audience. All the pages, and about 40 others. Francatelli did not lose his temper in a corridor. He did it in front of the assembled staff of a royal palace, which is precisely why it could not be absorbed. A household that ran on invisibility could tolerate almost anything except a scene. The story travelled. The Times and the Dublin Evening Mail carried it on the 3rd of December, the Examiner on the 4th, the Spectator on the 11th, the Bucks Herald on the 11th as well. For 10 days in the winter of 1841, the internal politics of the royal kitchen were national news. There was one further piece of bad luck. Errol, the Lord Steward who had appointed Francatelli and might have protected him, had been replaced by the 3rd Earl of Liverpool on the 3rd of September, 1841, 3 months before the fracas. The man who owed him nothing was in the chair. His salary went on being paid until the 31st of March, 1842, which suggests he was given, or gave, a quarter's notice in the usual way, his title intact, to the last day. On the 1st of April, Morel, the former first master cook, moved up into the job at £60, 13 shillings and 7 pence a quarter, slightly less than Francatelli had been drawing. The royal household saved a few pounds a year and lost the best cook in Britain. Francatelli himself never explained. Giving evidence in November 1843, all he would say was that he had formerly been in the service of Her Majesty for 2 years. What drove him is the part the record only hints at. One account, from a life of the chef Alexis Soyer, says he thought himself underpaid and hated the foul-smelling, ill-ventilated kitchens at Buckingham Palace, which were badly in need of modernising. That is the only surviving statement about working conditions in the royal kitchen of the 1840s, and it is written about the man rather than by him. Not everyone read the affair as a matter of temper. A novelist writing in a London magazine the following year offered the fashionable version, that under Victoria, Francatelli, whom she called the Coriolanus of Pimlico, had been banished from the royal kitchen, and that future travellers would come to the stately furnaces and stoves of Windsor Castle and cry aloud, "Where is the French cook?" That is a joke about national taste, made at the time, and it tells you more about the audience than about the man. Read the record beside the wage list, and the temper starts to look less like temperament and more like arithmetic. He had trained under a man paid £2,000. He had worked in a club that paid £1,200. He was on 250. In a kitchen he found badly built and badly aired, in a household where a deputy comptroller could overrule him and 40 people would watch it happen. One last correction. Almost every retelling credits Francatelli with 2 yeomen of the kitchen and 24 subordinate cooks. The 24 comes from a popular cookery book of 1989, not from an archive. The Lord Steward's account books, read properly, give him 16 posts in total. A chief cook, 3 master cooks, 2 yeomen, 3 roast cooks, 4 apprentices, 2 scourers, and a single kitchen maid. 16 people. One of them a woman. He went on to better things, becoming chef to the Prince and Princess of Wales at Marlborough House by 1863, and staying at least 3 years. But the kitchen he left behind at Windsor and Buckingham Palace kept running exactly as before, on a rule he had broken in the most public way possible. The rule was that the machinery must not be seen, and at Windsor it was posted on the wall. Chapter 7. A staircase you could lose your place for climbing. There was a notice on the kitchen stairs at Windsor, and it was signed by the master of the household himself. It read, "No one is under any circumstances permitted to ascend or descend this staircase, excepting those serving at or for the royal table. By order, the master of the household." Every element of that sentence is doing work. Under any circumstances closes every excuse. Ascend or descend closes both directions. Excepting those serving at or for the royal table draws the line not around a rank or a department, but around a single meal. And by order, followed by the title of the man who ran the entire domestic side of the palace, tells the reader what happens to anyone who tests it. The master of the household was the officer who, after Prince Albert's reforms of the 1840s, held authority over the working household in one pair of hands. His name did not need to appear. His office was enough. The notice also says something about the traffic on those stairs. A rule gets written down and signed by an officer of the Crown when somebody expects it to be tested. The household's answer was to print a prohibition and fix it to the wall, so that the offence became formal and the consequence became automatic. That staircase carried the food from the kitchen up to the state floor, and for most of the people in the building, it did not exist. The rules of invisibility in a British great house are usually described in soft terms: the green baize door, the back stairs, the hierarchy of tables, servants not to be seen at work. Those customs were real, and Below the Stairs has walked through them in house after house. What Windsor supplies is the same idea, hardened into an instruction, signed by an officer of the Crown, and nailed up where the people it governed would read it every day of their working lives. The building was arranged to make the rule easy to keep. The great kitchen sits on the ground floor of the North Range. St. George's Hall, where the banquets were eaten, sits on the first floor of the same range, directly above. Edward III's design had put the service chambers and the cellars underneath, and the grand rooms on top. And 500 years later, the arrangement still governed who walked where. Food went up, people did not. Where the people went instead was up 7 stories of the Prince of Wales's tower, where the kitchen and pantry staff slept. 7 floors. At the end of a working day in a room with 8 fireplaces burning in it, carrying nothing but themselves, up a tower. The 1897 account records that detail in passing, as if it were unremarkable, which to the writer it clearly was. Downstairs, the servants' hall at Windsor was a genuinely grand room, and its grandeur is part of the point. It had an arched roof carried on 4 pillars and 2 large fireplaces. 3 lines of tables ran the entire length of the hall, and the middle of the 3 was not for sitting at. It was the serving table. The floor was evenly dusted with very fine yellow sand, which was swept up and renewed 3 times a day. 3 times a day. A floor that has to be swept up and dressed again 3 times between morning and night is a floor carrying a great deal of traffic and a great deal of spillage. That single housekeeping detail measures the volume of human movement through the servants' hall more precisely than any head count could. In the corridor outside stood 6 large bookcases holding what the writer calls a library of exceedingly well-selected and varied books for the use of the upper servants. For the use of the upper servants. Not for the kitchen maids, not for the apprentices, not for the scourers. The class system that the castle enforced through its green baize doors and its back stairs was reproduced in miniature in the corridor outside the servants' own dining room, in the form of a bookcase that most of them could look at and not open. And on the wall of that hall hung a framed set of maxims, described as the 12 good rules found in the study of Charles I of blessed memory. One of the 12 read, "Make no long meals. Hold that image, because it is the whole channel in one frame." In the servants' hall of Windsor Castle, above the tables where the people who had spent the day cooking the castle's dinners sat down to eat their own, hung a framed instruction not to linger over it. The rest of the household ate in its own rooms, by rank. The household dining room seated 6 to 12 every day. The Queen's own table sat wherever she chose. And in the great houses of the same period, the pattern went further still, into the elaborate hierarchy of the steward's room and the pug's parlour, where the upper servants kept a table of their own well away from the hall. The servants had servants' politics, and they observed them. What is remarkable about the Windsor record is how little of that hierarchy it describes and how much it enforces. The 1897 account draws only one distinction between the upper servants and everyone else, and it draws it through the ownership of 6 bookcases. Underneath all of it ran the supply. About 900 tons of coal were burnt in Windsor Castle in a year, brought in on trucks through the service tunnels the anonymous writer calls Underground Windsor, and hoisted by cranes up to the kitchen floor. 900 tons. Roughly 2.5 tons a day, every day, moved through tunnels beneath a castle by men whose working lives were arranged around being somewhere the guests were not. That is the shape of the whole system. Above ground, a court. Below ground, a railway of coal. And between them, a set of doors, stairs, and corridors built so that the two would never meet. The office that governed all this had only recently become real. For the first years of Victoria's reign, no single person ran the working household at all. Authority was split between 3 great officers of state. The Lord Chamberlain had the housekeepers, the pages, and the housemaids. The Lord Steward had the clerk of the kitchen, the cooks, and the porters. The Master of the Horse had the footmen, the livery porters, and the under-butlers. Baron Stockmar reported in January 1841 that a chaotic system of divided control existed, and recommended that one resident officer be given real power over the whole of it. Towards the end of 1844, and some accounts say 1845, the master of the household got it. So the signature at the bottom of that notice on the kitchen stairs belonged to an office that had only just been handed the authority to sign anything. The deepest expression of the rule is that notice, because a notice is a permanent statement of who a building is for. Windsor Castle in 1897 sheltered and gave employment to some 2,000 people. It was, in the anonymous writer's phrase, a small town. 2,000 people lived and worked inside one set of walls, and the movement of nearly all of them was restricted by rules that were built into the plan of the building, and where the plan was not enough, printed and hung up. That is the machinery. 8 fires, 4 ranges, over 40 people across the kitchen departments, 7 stories of dormitory, 3 lines of tables, sand renewed 3 times a day, and a staircase reserved for a single dinner. The question the rest of this story has to answer is what it was all producing and where the food actually went. Because in the centre of that room stood one table where every dinner in the castle met. Chapter 8. The table where both dinners met. In the middle of the room stood a steel table heated by steam, and every dinner in the castle was plated on it. The anonymous member of the household describes it precisely. A dishing-up table of steel, rimmed with brass, standing on hollow brass legs that were filled with steam to keep the surface hot. On it, in the writer's own words, were dished up the many large dinners of the royal family, the household, the servants and retainers of the castle. 4 dinners, 1 table. That sentence, written by somebody who watched it happen, settles a question that hangs over every story about service in a great house. It is the question of what the people below stairs actually ate, and whether the food that reached them was food or leavings. The servants of Windsor were not fed on what was left over. They were cooked for. Their dinners came out of the same kitchen, off the same ranges and were plated on the same steam-heated steel as the Queen's. That is what the source says, and it says it without any interest in the argument, because to the writer it was simply how the room worked. The administration went further than the cooking. The Queen ordered dinner at her own breakfast, from suggestions brought to her by the clerk of the kitchen. She made her alterations in her own hand, generally in violet ink pencil, and the amended menus went back down to the kitchens, the confectionery, and the other departments before 10 o'clock in the morning, to be carried out. Violet ink pencil, before 10. That is how a day at Windsor began. And then the detail that matters most. Other menus, the writer notes, those to be served to the household, the equerry's breakfast, even the meals for the servants, were all obliged to go through the same process of superintendence by clerks of the kitchen and storerooms and of head cooks, even the meals for the servants, written out, submitted, approved, costed, and cooked, through the same chain of clerks that handled the Queen's own dinner. The servants' hall dinner at Windsor was a document before it was a meal. The great kitchen was only the largest of several. Quite apart from it, the writer notes, stood the pastry kitchen, the green room, where nothing but the vegetables were prepared, and the confectionery kitchen. The confectioner had half a dozen subordinates of his own. The confectionery never stopped. The same 1897 account records that the confectionery cooks were kept busy all the year round at Windsor, because wherever the court might be, there had to follow a large supply of cakes. Wherever the court might be. Wherever she went, the cakes went after her, baked at Windsor, and the confectionery kitchen worked through the year for a household that was somewhere else entirely. There is a version of this story that would be easier to tell, in which the cooks of Windsor Castle were fed on scraps, and the injustice is simple, and the viewer's outrage is cheap. The record does not support it, and the servants themselves would have found it strange. In the great houses of Britain, servants' food was generally a separate stream. It was cooked separately, and it had its own standing repertoire of mutton, veal, stew, and fish. What came down from the family's table came down as a supplement and a treat, giving servants access to cold chicken, venison, pheasant, ices, and soufflés they would never otherwise have tasted. The leftovers were the good part. The clearest voice on this belongs to Margaret Powell, who wrote about service afterwards with no interest at all in being polite. Her complaint was not that servants were fed the family's leavings. Her complaint was that they were denied them. She wanted to know why the servants could not eat the leftovers of what the employers ate, rather than being given food the rich would have found unpalatable. Mutton and stew and fish downstairs, while the cold chicken and the venison and the pheasant stayed upstairs. The insult was the separate provision, not the shared one. At royal residences, the surplus did travel downward. The food historian Annie Gray, who has worked through the surviving royal ledgers, has established that service in the French style produced enormous structural surplus, that it was passed down the line within the household to the very bottom, and that it was also sent out regularly to welfare institutions, particularly schools and homes. Service in the French style, service à la française, is the mechanism at the centre of this entire film, and it needs explaining because it is not how anybody eats now. Under the French style, a course was not a plate, a course was a table. Vast quantities of food were set out simultaneously, hot and cold, meat and fish and sweet, and the diners selected from what was in front of them, rather than being brought plated courses in sequence. The difference between that and a modern dinner is the difference between a meal and a display. Under the French style, the abundance was the point, and abundance means, by definition, more than can be consumed. So the great kitchen at Windsor was built and staffed and fueled to produce, every single day, a quantity of food that was designed from the outset to exceed the appetite in the room above it. The surplus was the system's product, engineered in from the first course. And that surplus had somewhere to go, down through the household and out to institutions. When Edward VII's coronation banquet was postponed at short notice in 1902, the kitchens had already cooked it. Gabriel Tschumi and his colleagues melted the jellies down and stored them in 250 Magnum champagne bottles. The rest, caviar, 2,500 quails, chicken, partridge, sturgeon, and cutlets, went out in hampers to the sisters of the poor, to the families of the royal household, and to the poor of Whitechapel in the East End of London. 2,500 quails, cooked for a coronation that did not happen, eaten in Whitechapel. That is the system working as designed, and there is nothing shameful in it. It is efficient, and in its way, generous. But the generosity was made of something, and the something has to be counted. Food is only available to give away in that quantity because it was cooked in that quantity. And it was cooked in that quantity by people who were paid £15 a year and were not permitted to use the stairs. There is one documented case from the great house world of food travelling in the other direction, and it is worth setting down because of how completely it inverts the sentimental picture. Eric Horne, a butler who wrote his memoirs in 1923 after a lifetime in service, recorded a pudding that had been intended for the Duke of Cambridge and had somehow found its way onto the servants' table. A cook scraped it off their plates and back into the basin, to be sent up to the Duke, remarking that there would have been none left to return if he had come a few minutes later. A scrap going up to a duke. So the accusation that the cooks of Windsor ate the castle's scraps does not survive contact with the evidence, and it turns out to be the wrong accusation anyway. The real one is stranger, colder, and fully documented, and it is written into that steam-heated table in the middle of the room. Because on any given day, most of what was plated on that table for the Queen was not going to be eaten by anybody at all. Chapter 9. Cooked, carried up, and taken away again. Half the food that reached Queen Victoria's table every day was put there by people who knew she would never touch it. The anonymous writer of 1897 states it flatly, and the flatness is what makes it land. The entire time that sweet chestnuts are in perfection, they wrote. They are served every night at the Queen's table, even though for weeks together no one touches them. In fact, quite half the eatables that appear daily at the Queen's table are things that she herself never eats, but at the same time likes to see about her and to know they are there. Quite half. And then the second example, which is even harder. Although it is well known to all the Queen's cooks and personal servants that she never touches cold meat in any form, there is a stringent rule that the royal side tables, at both luncheon and dinner, are to be well supplied with cold viands, among which a roast sirloin of beef and poultry invariably figure. A stringent rule. That phrase is doing enormous work. This was not habit or oversight. It was policy. The kitchen was under standing orders to produce, twice a day, every day, a roast sirloin and poultry, cold, for a woman whose staff all knew she would not eat cold meat in any form. Somebody roasted that sirloin. Somebody let it cool, carved it or set it whole, arranged it, and sent it up. Somebody carried it up the stairs. Somebody set it on the side table. And at the end of the meal, somebody carried it away again. And the next day, the same thing happened, and the day after that. The chestnuts are the purest version. Chestnuts are seasonal, and imperfection means at their best. For that whole stretch of weeks, every night, somebody in that kitchen prepared chestnuts for the Queen's table. For weeks together, nobody touched them, and the next night they were prepared again. Hold on to the chestnuts, they come back. What makes this more than an eccentricity is the arithmetic behind it. Return to the French style of service, and the two facts lock together. A table laid in the French style is a table laid with more than can be eaten. A queen who liked to see things about her and to know they were there was operating that system exactly as designed. By the standards of her own table, she was being correct. And correctness, in that system, had a price, and the price was paid in the room below. Set the scale of the production against the scale of the consumption. 8 chimneys, 4 close ranges, 12 feet wide, open roasting fires taking 6 rows of joints at each end of the room, 6 chopping blocks the size of dining tables, 40 or more people on the establishment, about 900 tons of coal a year burnt in the castle, hauled through the service tunnels and lifted by crane to the kitchen floor. 2,000 people sheltered and employed inside the castle walls, and half of what went up to the top table was never intended for a human mouth. There is a particular cruelty in the shape of that work, and hunger has nothing to do with it. The cooks of Windsor were fed. They had their own dinners, cooked for them, plated on the same steel. The cruelty lies in the meaning of the labour. To cook something is to intend it to be eaten. That intention is the whole reason the craft exists. A dish prepared in the certain knowledge that nobody will eat it becomes scenery instead. The great kitchen at Windsor spent a significant part of its working life producing scenery, and the people producing it knew. That is what the phrase "well known to all the Queen's cooks and personal servants" really tells us. They knew. The information was not hidden from them or lost in the chain of command. The whole kitchen understood that the cold sirloin was going up to be looked at and brought down again, and the stringent rule made sure it went up anyway. The apparatus of display around that food ran on the same scale. The gold dinner service at Windsor was made for 140 people, and it was supplemented by 30 dozen gold plates, which is another 360. The castle held 180 pairs of silver candlesticks for the table, and they were frequently all in use at once. 360 gold plates and 360 candlesticks brought out, arranged, cleared, and cleaned again. Every one of those objects had to be carried, set, watched, collected, and washed by hand, by people whose names appear in none of the inventories that record the objects. And every dish that went up was written down. In a small private room off the kitchen, the chef kept blue paper-covered books on the windowsill in which the royal and household menus were entered daily, along with the quantities of materials used in the different dishes. That was Prince Albert's system, working exactly as intended. A kitchen made to record what it consumed. So the waste was documented, in the chef's own hand, every day, in a book on a windowsill. Somebody wrote down the chestnuts. That is the detail that turns this from carelessness into something colder. A careless household does not keep ledgers. Windsor kept them. The quantity of chestnuts bought, prepared, and sent upstairs went into the book, and the fact that nobody ate them went into nothing at all, because the book recorded materials used, and by the standards of that book, the chestnuts had been used. They had gone up. Their use was to be present. The phrase the writer uses is that the Queen liked to see things about her and to know they were there. That is the whole rule in a dozen words. The food was there to be known about. Its presence was the service. Its consumption was optional. And in the case of the chestnuts and the cold sirloin, it was entirely theoretical. A household that wanted to stop doing this could have stopped at any time. Nobody in the chain had the standing to raise it. The clerk of the kitchen submitted his suggestions. The Queen amended them in violet pencil. The amended menus went back down before 10 in the morning. Somewhere in that loop, a stringent rule about cold viands had been set, and once set, it simply ran, day after day, for as long as she lived. The side table had to be full. Whether anybody ate from it was beside the point. There was one exception, and it is the small fire at the west end of the kitchen. The birds that went to the Queen's own table were roasted there, apart from the industrial ranges, on a domestic hearth. Those she ate. Somewhere in that room, a cook was preparing food that would genuinely be consumed by the person it was made for, and it was such a small proportion of the output that it had its own separate fire. The rest went up in quantity, to be arranged, admired, and removed. And the removal, when it came fast. Because the woman who sat at the head of that table had a way of eating that made even the food she did want into a kind of casualty. Chapter 10. 30 minutes at the top of the stairs. A day of work in the kitchen could be eaten in half an hour, and often it was barely eaten at all. Queen Victoria ate quickly. This is not an impression left by hostile witnesses. It is the settled finding of the food historian who has worked through her household ledgers. And the figure she gives is that Victoria could get through all 6 courses of dinner in 30 minutes. 6 courses, half an hour, 5 minutes a course, including the clearing and relaying between them. Other accounts put it at 7 courses in the same time, or 6 to 10 courses in as little as half an hour. The counts vary. The direction does not. By every account that survives, dinner at Victoria's table moved at a speed that startled people who were used to eating with the rich. On its own, that is a quirk. What turns it into something else is the rule that went with it, and the rule is documented in the press of the day. A Californian newspaper in 1880 put it with the bluntness of a foreign correspondent who does not have to be tactful. It is no fun for a hungry person to dine with Queen Victoria, the paper reported. It is not etiquette to eat of anything after she has finished with it, and as Her Majesty eats very little, the courses are hurried over. That is the whole machine in 2 sentences. When the Queen finished a course, the course was over, and the plates went, whether or not the person holding a fork over them had begun. And there is a witness from inside the room. Marie Adiane Mallet served Victoria first as a maid of honour and then as a woman of the bedchamber, which meant she was in attendance at the Queen's table constantly, for years, and she wrote home about it. Her letters were published by her son long afterwards. The service, she wrote, was so rapid that a slow eater such as myself never had time to finish even a moderate helping. Never had time to finish. Not once. Not on a bad night. As a standing condition of her employment, a woman of the court went hungry at the Queen's dinner table in a castle with the oldest working kitchen in the country underneath it. The scale of what that kitchen could put on a table for a single evening is easiest to see in the banquets. The Royal Collection's own account of the room tells visitors about the elaborate dinners prepared for successive monarchs, including 30-course banquets in the time of George IV. That figure comes from the Royal Collection's tour material rather than from an audited record, and the volume in the Royal Archives that would settle it, an entire book devoted to George IV's coronation banquet with its seating plans and food lists and drawings of the table, was not accessible. So the 30 stands as the Royal Collection's own description of the room's output, and no further. The modern version is still enormous. A state banquet at Windsor is eaten in St. George's Hall, at a table seating 160 50 metres long, running the whole length of the room, with the monarch and the visiting head of state in the centre, and musicians playing from the balcony at the end. Laying that table takes 5 full days. It is set to a ruler. Over 2,000 pieces of silver gilt cutlery and 1,000 glasses go onto it, and every one of them is washed afterwards by hand. Planning begins 6 months ahead. 5 days to lay a table, 6 months to plan a dinner. The eating of it takes an evening. In Victoria's household, the ordinary evening ran to a timetable too. The household assembled for dinner between 8:30 and 9:15. Guests invited to dine and sleep were gone again between 11 and 12 the following morning. Every part of the court's day was scheduled, timed, and administered, apart from the one thing the kitchen most needed to know, which was whether anybody was going to eat what it sent up. Now put the two halves of the building together, because this is the moment the story has been building towards. Downstairs, 8 fires, 4 ranges, 6 rows of joints at each open hearth, 40 joints turning at once before a state banquet, 40 people on the establishment, 900 tons of coal a year. A storekeeper at his desk checking the quantities of food in course of cooking as it went. Upstairs, 6 courses in 30 minutes, half of it never intended to be eaten, and the guests who did want it not permitted to finish. Between the two, a staircase. That staircase deserves attention because it is the hardest single thing about this kitchen, and the record is almost silent on it. At Windsor Castle, every dish had to be carried up narrow stairs from the great kitchen to the state apartments. The kitchen is on the ground floor of the North Range. St. George's Hall is on the first floor of the same range, directly above it. Between the food and the table lay a flight of narrow stairs, and for much of the room's working life there was no lift. No source gives the distance. No source gives the route, or a tunnel, or a heated trolley, or a date when a lift was finally installed. That measurement, which every account of a great house loves to quote, does not exist for Windsor. What exists instead is better, because it is human. The chefs of the day, according to an account of the modern tour, used to prepare 20 extra portions to allow for droppages and breakages on the way up. 20 spare dinners, because the journey was expected to destroy that many. 20 portions is not a rounding error. It is an institutional admission that the route from the kitchen to the table broke food, regularly and predictably, and that the cheapest solution was to cook more of it. Somewhere on those narrow stairs, night after night, plates went down, and the kitchen had already replaced them before it happened. Nobody wrote down what happened to the person who dropped one. The pattern repeats across every part of this story. The room is measured, and the people are not. The coal is weighed, and the hours are not. The joints are counted by the storekeeper at his desk as they cook, and the number of times a cook was blamed for a broken dish on a dark stair is not recorded anywhere at all. There is a temptation to make Victoria the villain of this chapter, and it should be resisted, because the etiquette was not of her making. Nobody was to eat of anything after the sovereign had finished with it. That was the rule of a court, older than she was, and she inherited it along with the castle and the kitchen and the notice on the stairs. What she added was speed, and the speed turned an old etiquette into a small daily cruelty for everybody at her table, and a daily absurdity for everybody underneath it. 600 years of continuous cooking, 900 tons of coal, 40 people, a stringent rule about cold sirloin, 20 spare portions against breakages, and 30 minutes. And even then, the food that came back down the stairs was not the largest waste in the building. That was happening in the accounts, and it had been going on so long that nobody could remember how it started. Chapter 11. Candles, Wine, and the Red Room. Somewhere in the accounts of Windsor Castle was a payment of 35 shillings a week for wine in a room that no longer existed. Prince Albert found it. Going through the household books in the 1840s, looking for the leaks in a system he had already been told was chaotic, he came across a weekly expenditure of 35 shillings on something called Red Room wine, and he could not work out what it was. The explanation, as Lytton Strachey later told it, was this. In the time of George III, a room in Windsor Castle with red hangings had been used as a guardroom, and 5 shillings a day had been allowed to provide wine for the officers on duty there. The guard had long since been moved somewhere else. The payment had not. The money was still being drawn, week after week, decade after decade, by a half-pay officer who held the sinecure position of under-butler. A sinecure is a post that carries a salary and no duties. Half-pay meant a military officer not currently serving, kept on a retainer. So the arrangement was this. A man not doing a job in the army was drawing money for wine for a guard that was not there, in a room that had stopped being a guard room long before. 35 shillings a week does not sound like a fortune. Over decades, drawn without interruption, for nothing, by somebody whose only qualification was that the payment had never been stopped, it becomes something else. It becomes a portrait of an institution that had lost the ability to know what it was paying for. And beside it sat the candles. There was, in the royal household, an ancient and immutable rule that a candle which had once been lighted should never be lighted again. Not a preference, a rule. A candle used for an hour at dinner was finished. It did not go back into the box. What happened to the old candles, the account notes dryly, nobody knew. Everybody knew. That is the joke, and it is a bitter one. The candles were annexed, in the 1897 writer's exact word, by certain officials and their underlings, although perfectly fit to be brought forth again. So was the wine. So was anything else imperishable that had been produced for a particular occasion and left untouched. This was the perquisite system, and it needs to be understood properly, because it is the hinge of this chapter and the moral centre of the film. A perquisite was a customary right to take something from the workplace and keep or sell it. To the people doing it, this was ancient, universal, and understood by both sides as part of what the job paid. A cook's perquisites might include the dripping, the fat rendered from roasting meat, and the bones, and the empty tins and jars. In a kitchen roasting 6 rows of joints at 2 open fires, the dripping alone was a substantial and continuous income, and a cook counted on it. The 1897 Insider, writing more than 50 years after the fact, describes the same system in almost the same words that a satirist would use a generation later, and the agreement between them is what makes it credible. The perquisite system, the writer says, was in full force. Wine or candles, and other imperishable articles which had been produced for any particular occasion and had remained untouched, were calmly annexed by certain officials and their underlings, although perfectly fit to be brought forth again. And then the line that lands hardest. Those were the days when scores of people outside the palaces lived in luxury on the proceeds of robbery and waste within. Scores of people, living in luxury. Outside the palace, on what came out of it. 2 independent sources, 80 years apart, one hostile to the monarchy and one working for it, name the same 2 commodities, wine and candles. That is about as close to proof as this kind of household history ever gets. Now hold the perquisite system beside the chestnuts, because they are the same thing seen from 2 directions. Upstairs, food was produced in quantities designed never to be eaten, and the surplus was the point. Downstairs, goods were produced in quantities designed never to be used, and the surplus walked out of the building and was sold. The candle that could not be lit twice and the chestnut that was never touched came out of the same logic. A household so rich that consumption was beside the point, and so badly governed that nobody was counting. And then Albert counted. His reorganization of the household, following Baron Stockmar's report of January 1841, and taking effect when a permanent resident master of the household was given real authority in the middle of the decade, went through the perquisites and abolished them. In Strachey's summary, great economies were made, and the whole crowd of venerable abuses was swept away. The half-pay officer of the Red Room was, much to his surprise, given the choice of relinquishing his weekly payment or of performing the actual duties of an under-butler. That is a genuinely funny sentence, and the man's surprise is the funniest part of it. He had drawn the money for so long that being asked to work for it came as a shock. But the reform has a second face, and the record preserves it. When the perquisites went, so did a portion of the income of the lowest paid people in the building. The cook who had counted on the dripping and the bones lost the dripping and the bones. Household manuals of the period argued exactly this, that the honest answer was to raise wages by the value of the perquisite in order, as one put it, to diminish the contest between honest and dishonest principles. And the reaction to Albert's economies was not gratitude. There were outcries and complaints. The prince was accused of meddling, of injustice, and of saving candle ends. Saving candle ends. That was the insult aimed at the man who had stopped a household paying for wine for a guard that had long since moved elsewhere. What the reform could not touch was the arithmetic of the table upstairs. The perquisites were an accounting problem, and Albert was extremely good at accounting problems. The chestnuts were a rule, and rules of that kind belonged to the Queen. So the two kinds of waste in that building met entirely different fates. The waste that left through the servants' door, in candle ends and unopened wine, was hunted down, itemized, and stopped inside 4 years. The waste that went up the stairs on a plate, cooked by paid staff at public expense to be looked at and carried down again, ran on for the rest of the reign, unquestioned, because nobody in that household would have called it waste. They called it the Queen's table. So the accounts were cleaned, the sinecure was closed, the candles stopped disappearing, and the kitchen carried on exactly as before. The chestnuts still went up in season. The cold sirloin still went up twice a day. The notice stayed on the stairs. The room had absorbed a revolution in its own administration without changing a single thing about the work. It would take something considerably more violent than a prince with a ledger to change this room. And when it came out of a curtain on a November morning directly above the kitchen gate. Chapter 12. What the fire took off the roof. At 11:15 on a November morning in 1992, a spotlight touched a curtain directly above the kitchen gate. The room it happened in was Queen Victoria's private chapel in the northeast corner of the upper ward. Edward Blore had built that chapel in the upper story of the old kitchen gatehouse, the medieval gate that led into the kitchen yard. So the fire that would gut Windsor Castle started, quite literally, on top of the way into the kitchen. It was the 20th of November, 1992. Renovation work was underway, and a spotlight had been left pressed against a curtain. The curtains were 30 feet long. When they caught, they came down burning. The room was cleared at 32 minutes past 11, 17 minutes after it began. The fire burned for 15 hours. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the floors of the Brunswick Tower collapsed. At 7 in the evening, the roof of St. George's Hall came down, the room that sits directly above the great kitchen's range. The fire was brought under control by 8. The main body of it was out by 11 at night, and the last secondary fires were extinguished at 2:30 the following morning. At its height, 39 fire appliances and 225 firefighters were engaged. They used 1.5 million gallons of water, which is 7 million litres, poured into a building whose oldest walls were laid in the 12th century. The salvage operation ran alongside the firefighting. 125 castle staff, 125 contractors, 100 military personnel, and 20 staff from the Crown estate carried out what could be carried out. 9 of the principal staterooms were destroyed. More than 100 others were severely damaged. Most accounts of that night stop there, with St. George's Hall and the state apartments, because those are the rooms with the paintings in them. The great kitchen burned too. It lost its plaster coving and most of its medieval timber. It is named among the rooms completely or largely destroyed, alongside St. George's Hall, the lantern lobby, the octagonal dining room, and the chapel where it all started. Photographs taken afterwards show the room with its ceiling down and debris lying across the central tables, the tables where the 4 dinners of the castle had been plated. This is not universally acknowledged. The Royal Collection's own summary of the fire lists the destroyed rooms and does not mention the kitchen. Tour material tends to present the room as a survivor. The photographs and the timber loss say otherwise, and the restoration record says otherwise. And the honest account is that the oldest working kitchen in the country very nearly stopped working in 1992. Then the restoration team went up into the roof and found the strangest thing in this entire story. When the burnt material was stripped out of the kitchen roof, the restoration team found something underneath it that nobody had expected to be there. For a century and a half, everybody had assumed that the roof over the great kitchen was 19th century work. It looked it. It had odd crenellations, iron brackets, fixings, the whole vocabulary of Victorian Gothic. The obvious conclusion was that Wyatville, remodelling the castle for George IV, had swept the medieval roof away and put up a fashionable replacement. He had not. One of the architects who led the restoration described what they found in plain words. There was always an assumption with the medieval kitchen that the roof had been replaced as part of Wyatville's work because it has all these weird crenellations and iron brackets and things on it. But what they uncovered was medieval. Either Wyatville or Blore had covered up the medieval roof structure with bits of wood and bits of iron and stuff to make it look like a Victorian Gothic roof structure. That sentence is the thesis of this whole story, rendered in oak and iron. The Victorians did not destroy the medieval roof of Windsor's great kitchen. They dressed it up as a fake medieval roof because their own idea of the Middle Ages looked better to them than the actual Middle Ages did. The real thing was hidden inside the imitation of itself, and it took a catastrophic fire 150 years later to take the costume off. The timbers were reinforced rather than replaced by an engineer named Richard Swift. Ventilating the restored room proved almost impossible because with the roof and its lantern now exposed and the space standing 3 stories high, there was nowhere left to conceal a duct. The scale of the loss was hard to take in, even for the people standing in it. 9 principal staterooms gone. More than 100 others damaged. A building added to by monarch after monarch since the 14th century, burning for 15 hours, while 125 members of castle staff carried out what they could into the courtyards, alongside 100 soldiers, 125 contractors and 20 staff from the Crown estate. And when the water stopped, the room that had been cooking since the 1360s was standing with its coving down and most of its medieval timber gone. During the clearance of the rubble, something else came to light. A well, 150 feet deep, running down to the level of the River Thames. A hidden well, a hidden roof, and underneath both of them, the record of the people who had worked in the room. Still hidden, still unopened, in wage books and account ledgers that nobody has yet gone through. The roof, at least, could be dated. And when the laboratories finished with it, the date turned out to belong to a king that no account of this room had ever mentioned. Chapter 13. 3 Kings Worth of Oak. The roof everyone calls Edward III's turns out to belong to a king who reigned 130 years later. After the fire, 44 oak timbers were taken for tree ring analysis, drawn from the Great Kitchen, the roof trusses of St. George's Hall, and the floor of the Grand Reception Room. Tree ring dating works because the width of a tree's annual rings varies with the weather, so a length of timber carries a pattern that can be matched against master sequences built from thousands of other samples. Done well, it can give the year a tree was felled. 2 sequences were assembled from Windsor's timbers, one of 14 ring patterns and one of 21. The longer of the 2 runs, 151 years, from 1423 to 1573. And the results for the kitchen roof were not what anybody had been saying. One lower wall plate, the horizontal timber that sits on top of the wall and carries the roof, was felled after 1337. That one belongs to Edward III's building, and it is the only piece that does. The roof structure itself, box-framed, with arch braces, tie beams, king post, and, crucially, Louvre posts, dates to 1489. Louvre posts are the timbers that frame the lantern in the roof, the opening that let the smoke and heat out. So the lantern that Gabriel Tschumi looked up at as a boy of 16 and compared to a chapel was not Edward III's at all. It went up in the reign of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, 130 years after the kitchen was built. Then a further layer. Repairs using hammer beams, king posts and purlins date to 1577 in the reign of Elizabeth I. More dated repairs follow from 1719 onward. And a separate record shows Edward IV carrying out repairs to the kitchen roof in 1468, 21 years before Henry VII replaced it. 5 separate campaigns of work across 4 centuries in one roof. That is what the fire uncovered, a medieval roof in the truest sense, meaning a thing mended by every generation that used it, until the mending itself was 600 years old. The room, in other words, is exactly like the record of the people who worked in it, layered, patched, partial, and far more interesting once somebody looks properly. 10 of the kitchen roof samples went on to do something nobody could have predicted. They were dissected ring by ring to supply single-year reference standards for radiocarbon dating, taken from the growth rings of 1503, 1515 and 1524, and sent to laboratories in Groningen, in Zurich, and in Bristol. Oak that grew in the early 1500s, cut for a kitchen roof, burnt in 1992, now calibrates the dating of archaeological finds in 3 countries. The restoration around it took 5 years and cost £36.5 million. The initial fear had been 60 million. The castle was not insured. Occupied royal palaces were regarded as too valuable to insure, which is a sentence that repays a moment's thought, since it means the risk had simply been accepted. 70% of the cost was met by opening Buckingham Palace to paying visitors at £8 a head, and by charging for admission to the Windsor precincts for 5 years. The decision was announced on the 29th of April, 1993. The Queen contributed £2 million personally, and from that same year, she began paying income tax. Donald Insall Associates led the restoration. Sidel Gibson designed the new St. George's Hall and the new lantern lobby. Giles Downs designed a hammer beam roof of green oak, described at the time as the largest green oak structure raised since the Middle Ages. The Restoration Committee was chaired by the Duke of Edinburgh. Green oak, cut and raised in the 1990s over a kitchen roofed in oak felled in 1489 against a wall laid in the 12th century. The building answered the fire the way it has always answered everything, by adding another layer and carrying on. Structural work was finished by May 1996. The fitting out was completed on the 17th of November 1997, ahead of schedule. The castle reopened on the 20th of November 1997, exactly 5 years to the day after the fire, timed to the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh's 50th wedding anniversary. The kitchen went back to work. The way that money was raised closes a circle that runs through everything this channel covers. The British Great House and the Royal Palace both operated on the principle that the working parts must never be seen. Then the country houses began to fall, and the ones that survived did so by selling tickets. And in 1993, the Crown itself, facing an uninsured bill of £36.5 million, did precisely the same thing. The rescue of Windsor Castle was paid for by letting the public in, which is how, in the end, anybody came to be standing in the great kitchen at all. Chapter 14. The names the room did not keep. The record knows the width of the ranges to the foot, and it does not know the name of a single person who stood at them. Across the whole of Queen Victoria's 63-year reign, the accessible record produces one name for a royal chef. It comes from the London City Press of the 29th of October 1864, reporting a dinner of the United Cooks Pension Society, where the guests included a Mr. Aberlin, chef to Her Majesty. That is it. A charity dinner guest list. The fullest description of the room ever written was produced by somebody who did not sign it. The anonymous member of the royal household who wrote in 1897 knew the chef's salary to within a few pounds, the width of the ranges to the foot, the height of the meat screens, the number of chopping blocks, the wording of the notice on the service stair, the number of times a day the servants' hall floor was resanded, and the fact that the Queen was served chestnuts every night for weeks and never touched them. They are the principal witness in this entire story, and nobody knows who they were. 3 people can be named, and they are worth naming properly. Charles Elmé Francatelli, trained by Carême, paid a fifth of what a card club paid its chef, who kept his department in continual broils and finally shouted at the deputy comptroller in front of 40 people and ran from a policeman. He lasted 2 years and never explained himself. Gabriel Tschumi, who arrived at 16 from Switzerland at the very end of Victoria's reign, got in because his cousin Louise was one of the Queen's dressers, and looked up at that roof on his first day and thought of a chapel. He stayed more than 30 years. He rose from apprentice to third chef, was given a service medal in 1930, retired in 1932, and went on to cook for a duke and then for a queen in her widowhood. The royal family called him Chummy. He wrote a memoir, which is the only reason any of this is known, and even he could not always be relied on. He claimed curry was served at Windsor every day at luncheon, and the ledgers show it was twice a week, and only ever at the Queen's table. And Mildred Nichols, who is the one this film should end with. She was first employed as the 7th kitchen maid at Buckingham Palace in 1907. 7th. Not a rank with any dignity in it, and not a rank anybody outside that kitchen would ever have heard spoken. By 1919, when she left service, she had risen to number 3 in the hierarchy, 12 years, from 7th to 3rd. What survives of Mildred Nichols is her handwriting. She left charming handwritten notes on the recipes used by the pastry chefs. Royal plum pudding, crème à la carême, pudding soufflé à la royale, and rodgrod, a favourite of Queen Alexandra's. Her notes are on somebody else's recipes, for dishes somebody else invented, made for people she would never sit down with. That is what a life below stairs leaves behind. Marginalia. The room she worked in is still working. The kitchens of the royal household are run today by a royal chef, with a pastry chef and a chef de partie named on the household's own website, in a pastry and cold foods room described as bigger than most industrial kitchens. State banquets are still cooked in the great kitchen and carried up to St. George's Hall, where the table seats 160 and runs 50 meters, the whole length of the room, and takes 5 full days to lay. In 2018, the kitchen fed up to 600 guests at a royal wedding reception. The copper is still on the walls, though the photographs show it is no longer packed as densely as it was in 1878, and the pots no longer hang with their lids behind them. The clock still reads G. the 4th Rex, 1828. Water baths stand next to Victorian gas hobs. The old oak work tables are topped with stainless steel now. And from the 30th of July to the 28th of September, 2026, 5 days a week, members of the public pay £40 a head to walk into it and look around. A room built so that its workers would never be looked at, sells tickets to be looked at. The chestnuts are the thing to hold on to. Every night, for the weeks they were in season, somebody in that kitchen prepared them, and somebody carried them up the stairs that most of the castle was forbidden to use and set them on the table, and nobody touched them, and somebody carried them down again. The record kept the chestnuts. It kept the width of the ranges, the height of the screens, the 900 tons of coal, the 35 shillings a week for wine in a room that had stopped existing. It did not keep the names of the people who carried the plates. That is the true cost of a building that never stops. A house that falls gets an inventory, an auction catalogue, a photograph of the last day, a moment when somebody counts what is being lost. Windsor never fell. The great kitchen has never had a last day. It has had 650 years of ordinary mornings, and an ordinary morning does not get written down. Somewhere beneath the state rooms of Windsor Castle, there is a fire that has been going out and being relit for 600 years, and it has warmed the hands of thousands of people whose names nobody wrote on anything. The stone remembers. The clock remembers. The oak in the roof remembers 3 separate kings. The people were the only part of that room that was never meant to last, and they are the only part that made it work. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, and I will keep taking you into the rooms the tours walk past. And tell me in the comments, if you had worked in that kitchen, could you have carried up a dish every night for weeks, knowing nobody would ever touch it?